I don't know if you guys are ready for the glory of my Google Sheets charts here and my hand-drawn stats on them, but I do want to explain, so in this video, since we're looking at so many GPUs, and I don't want to just look at their relative performance to one GPU, I want to look at how do they perform relatively to the generation that came before them. We'll be seeing charts like this, where you can still see my normal stats counters, frame time graph lines, all of that. But then we'll be focusing on the average FPS by the end of the benchmark run, and then I'm going to hand draw. There might be some better way of doing this. Did you guys know that just because you are a math teacher doesn't mean you actually have any idea how to make good charts on a computer? Anyway, I just like hand drawing things, like frowny faces when we see the 4060 not any faster than the 3060 because it's using too much VRAM in the game. Anyway, whatever. So what you're seeing here in red is the generational uplift relative to the previous generation, along with the bar chart actually showing the overall result. Anyway, what we're looking at today is the generational differences from the 1060 to the 2060 to the 3060 to the 4060. And since many of these had different VRAM models available, we're looking at the 6GB 1060. There was also a 3GB version. We're looking at the 6GB 2060. Much later on, they eventually released a 12GB version during the whole crypto boom. And then the 3060 12GB, at some point they released an 8GB version of this card, which you just shouldn't buy. And then we're looking at the 4060 8GB, and you can see why sometimes having 8GB is not as good as having more. Anyway, let's jump into all of the benchmarks, and then I'll give a whole bunch of final thoughts on all of this at the end. We'll start our testing with some PlayStation 5 exclusives, and some of these can be very VRAM hungry despite a lot of patches to help out. This is The Last of Us Part 1, and at 1080p Ultra, the 1060 is only good for 22 FPS. You almost double your performance going up to the 2060 at 43 FPS. You get a 47% jump going up to the 3060 12GB, which is now at about 63 FPS, and I think that's influenced by the VRAM being over 6GB of usage here. And then a 22% bump going from the 3060 12GB up to the 4060. Now, if we tweak the settings down to high, we're going to see all cards scale a lot better here and the overall VRAM usage drop a lot. I think this fits better into 6GB, although it can still spill over it at times. We now see the 1060 able to deliver 32 FPS average, a 72% jump up to the 2060 at 55 FPS, a 40% jump up from there to the 3060 at 77 FPS, and then a 21% jump from there up to 93 FPS on the 4060 8GB. So we certainly see the generational climb dip as we go. But oh no, at 1440p Ultra preset, we now see the 3060 and the 4060 tied at a 42 FPS average here, because you can see if you look at the VRAM counter on the 3060, we're using more than 8GB of VRAM here, and that's significantly slowing down the 4060. The 1060 is only good for 14 FPS. We almost double that going up to the 2060 at 27 FPS, but still below 30. And it's a 56% jump from the 2060 to the 3060. Again, I think that lead is accentuated generationally by the VRAM differences. Now, if we drop down to the high preset, the game does a much better job of staying under 8GB and even not too far over 6GB, although it is still over 6. The 1060 is now good for 19 FPS. An 84% jump gets you to the 2060 at 35 FPS. A 49% jump from there gets you to the 3060 at 52 FPS, and the 4060 can hit 61 FPS, which is only a 17% jump from the 3060 12GB. So definitely not a massive generational improvement, but at least we got one that time. If we go over to Returnal, this game is not nearly as heavy on the VRAM usage, or just in general as demanding. So we can see the 1060 at 1080p Epic offering us 34 frames per second. We get a 74% jump to the 2060 at 59 FPS average, and then only a 17% jump to the 3060 at 69, and a 20% jump to the 4060 at 83 FPS. So you can see the difference between the 2060 and the 3060 a lot smaller this time, because the game's not going over 6GB of VRAM. So we can see the actual raw power of the cards is a lot closer than what we saw in The Last of Us, So you can see that the VRAM capacity helps a lot when it's needed, but doesn't help when it's not needed, right? If we go to 1440p epic settings, we now see the 1060 delivering 25 FPS. You get a 68% bump going up to the 2060 at 42 FPS, a 24% bump from there up to the 52 FPS on the 3060, and then you go from 52 to 61 if you get a 4060, which is only a 17% bump. So this is not too far off of a generational uplift from what we saw at the 1080p settings, because once again, we're not really smashing the 6 gigabyte VRAM capacity with these settings. Now, for Forspoken, I do my testing at its maximum preset, which does include some ray tracing, and that disqualifies the 1060. But also it uses a massive amount of VRAM, which is why we're now seeing a 63% jump from the 2060 to the 3060, going from 30 FPS average to 49 FPS average. And then buying the latest generation gets you a single FPS increase from 49 to 50. That's about 2%. What happened here? We went over 8 gigabytes of VRAM capacity. Interestingly, if we did get a 20% jump like probably was possible, we would have been hitting around 60 FPS if we had enough VRAM to handle it. Anyway, at 1440p, we're doing even worse because we're using even more VRAM. The 2060 is only good for 18 FPS now, and you almost double your performance going to the 3060 at 35 FPS, which is, hey, I guess if you wanted to play at a 30 FPS lock, but I think most people would be upscaling or reducing settings. And the 4060 actually loses by 3% here. It's getting 34 FPS instead of 35. So, yeah, not a good look for the new card. Even if these aren't settings you would actually probably use, it doesn't look good to lose to the previous generation card in any capacity. Now, looking at Star Wars Jedi Survivor at 1080p epic settings, we're jumping into no longer PlayStation 5 exclusives, but at least current gen exclusives. This one pushes Unreal Engine 4 about to its breaking point in some areas. The 1060 is only good for 26 FPS at Epic's preset, so you'd probably need to turn down settings on your 1060. You get an 88% jump going up to the 2060 at 49 FPS, a 22% jump from there up to 60 FPS on the 3060, and then only an 18% jump to the 71 FPS on the 4060, but hey, at least we did get an improvement and not lose frames that time. If we turn ray tracing on, we disqualify our 1060, but we're now getting about 31 FPS on the 2060 and jumping 65% to 51 FPS on the 3060. Then we jump from 51 FPS to about 61 FPS on the 4060, which is a 20% jump. And once again, we're seeing a large gap between the 2060 and 3060. We don't always see that. It seems to happen again when we're significantly spilling over our VRAM, which is happening here. You can see that the 3060, for example, is reporting almost 10 gigabytes allocated and 8 gigabytes used, which is just more than the 6 gigabyte card has and accentuates that difference. If we go up to 1440p epic settings, the 1060 is only getting a 16 FPS, and you exactly double that to 32 FPS by getting yourself a 2060. The 2060 goes from, the 3060 is now 38 FPS, which is only a 19% jump. And then we jump from 38 FPS to 44 FPS, which is only a 16% jump when we go up to the 4060. Now, 44 FPS, even 38 FPS is completely playable on a controller in this game, but a lot of people would probably just turn down settings from here. However, rather than turn down settings, we are going to explore what happens when we turn ray tracing on. And now, again, there's a much larger jump from the 2060 to the 3060. The ray tracing, I again think, is not just using more VRAM, but I think it becomes more crucial to have that VRAM like right there and not have to spill into system memory. And so now we're seeing a large jump of 84% going from 19 FPS completely unplayable to 35 FPS playable, but maybe not the settings you would choose on the 3060. And then jumping from 35 to 41, which is a 17% jump, going from the 3060 to the 4060. So while not an amazing jump, it doesn't look like the the VRAM's completely crushing it here in the way it did in other games like Forspoken, for example. Let's go on to Unreal Engine 5, Layers of Fear, 1080p high, which is the highest preset here. This is not a super demanding game, so we see the 1060 delivering 37 FPS. You get a 76% jump going up to the 2060 at 65 FPS, a 20% jump from there, getting you 78 FPS on the 3060, and a 22% jump from there, getting you 95 FPS on the 4060. If we turn on ray tracing, we lose the 1060 from our chart. But now the 2060 is good for 56 FPS, and you get a 30% jump going up to the 73 FPS on the 3060, and from there you jump 18% going from 73 to 86 by using the 4060. We're nowhere near 8 gigabytes of VRAM here, so that's not playing into things. If we go up to 1440p high settings, the 1060 is only good for 23 FPS. But you jump 78% up to 41 FPS on the 2060. From there, you jump 27% up to 52 FPS on the 3060, and then you jump only 14%, going from 52 to 59 on the 4060. If we turn on ray tracing, we once again lose our 1060 from our charts, and we're now at 39 FPS on the 2060, jump 23% to 48 FPS on the 3060, and then jump 19% from there to 57 FPS on the 4060. Once again, even at 1440p high with ray tracing on, we're actually below 5 gigabytes of VRAM usage here. And let's move on to A Plague Tale Requiem. This is not Unreal Engine. This is Sobo Studios' own engine at 1080p Ultra. We're getting the 27 FPS on the 1060, jump 78% by going to the 2060 at 48 FPS, and jump 17% to 56 FPS on the 3060, and then 16% up to 65 FPS on the 4060. Once again, this game stays under 5 gigabytes of VRAM usage. So again, I think we're not seeing as large of a difference from the 2060 to the 3060 as we do when the VRAM becomes an issue. At 1440p Ultra, we're still under 6 gigabytes of VRAM, so we're once again seeing similar scaling. The 1060 is only good for 18 FPS. You jump 78% up to 32 FPS on the 2060. You jump 19% up to the 3060 at 38 FPS, and jump 13% from 38 FPS up to 43 FPS on the 4060. Although I will mention this game does support DLSS 3 frame generation, and I have used it in this game, and it does work well here on the 4060. Let's look at some cross-gen games now. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 at 1080p balanced preset. The 1060 can get you about 52 FPS. You jump 77% up to 92 FPS on the 2060. You jump 24% up to 114 FPS on the 3060, and you jump 25% up to 143 FPS on the 4060. Once again, this is a game that stays well under the 6 gigabyte VRAM buffer, so that's not causing issues. If we go up to 1440p and stay at the balanced preset, the 1060 is now only good for 34 FPS. You jump up to 65 FPS on the 2060, which is a 91% increase. You jump up to 80 FPS on the 3060, which is a 23% increase from the 2060. And then the 4060 is 24% increase from there, getting you 99 FPS instead of 80. Now, let's go ahead and look at some other cross-gen games with Resident Evil 4. We'll start out at the 1080p prioritized graphics preset, which I noticed was turning on FSR2 quality on some GPUs but not others, so I just turned it on all of them. So this is upscaled 1080p. The 1060 at these settings, upscaled 1080p, is getting you 50 FPS. You jump 76% up to 88 FPS on the 2060. You jump 28% up to 113 FPS on the 3060. You jump 20% from there to 135 FPS on the 4060. But what happens when you turn on the max preset? Well, you lose the 1060 because it has ray tracing, and it goes way over the VRAM buffers on anything below the 12 gigabyte card. So the 2060 is crushed down to 24 FPS, and you get a 167% performance increase going up to the 3060 at 64 FPS, and then you lose 12% generationally going to the 4060, going down from 64 to 56 because it doesn't have enough VRAM for these settings. If we go to 1440p, but once again go to prioritize graphics, which does not include ray tracing and is using FSR2 quality upscaling, the 1060 is good for 35 FPS. It jumps 80% to 63 FPS on the 2060, it jumps 25% to 79 FPS on the 3060, and jumps 20% to 95 FPS on the 4060. So again, when the ray tracing is not included, The game can still use a lot of VRAM, but it's not anywhere near what it does when you hit the max settings, which we'll do here. And at 1440p max settings, the 2060 is only good for 23 FPS. Once again, we lose the 1060 off the charts. You get a 117% jump on the 3060 with 50 FPS, and you lose 16% performance going from the 3060 to the 4060. Again, because the ray tracing settings here are so hungry on VRAM, it just cannot keep up. And for ray tracing, it's very important to have your information in your VRAM and not spill over. Let's jump to another cross-gen game with Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p Ultra. The 1060 is only good for 29 FPS at these settings, and you basically double that to get 60 FPS on the 2060. And then you get a 22% uplift from there to get to 73 FPS on the 3060, and an 11% uplift from there to get to 81 FPS on the 4060. And again, this is staying under 6 gigabytes of VRAM usage. If we go up to 1440p Ultra, we now see the 1060 down to 18 FPS. We jump basically double performance to the 2060 at 37 FPS. You jump 22% up to 45 FPS on the 3060, but then you only gain 9% going from 45 FPS to 49 FPS, going from the 3060 to the 4060. It does not appear to be going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, so this is some other issue. Perhaps it's just the low memory bandwidth, that kind of a thing. If we turn on ray tracing, none of the GPUs do very well, but we're using more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So we lose the 1060 off the charts. The 2060 is only good for 17 FPS at 1080p RT Ultra with no upscaling. You jump 77% performance to the 3060, but that only gets you to 30 FPS. And again, I think that's due to the extra VRAM capacity, seeing that large of a jump. And then you only jump 13% going from 30 to 34 FPS on the 4060. Not really great results here. But you could use upscaling. I don't like upscaling at 1080p. I think you do lose a lot of the image quality. But if you're going to do it at the quality setting. And here at DLSS quality settings, we see the 2060 now able to deliver 31 FPS. You still jump 71% now going up to the 3060, so we're definitely still using, I think, more than 6 gigabytes of VRAM here. And that jumps you to 53 FPS on the 3060. Then you only gain 11% performance going from the 3060 to the 4060, getting you from 53 FPS to 59 FPS. Now on the far right, I am showing you that you can turn on frame generation, which I'll talk more about in the final thoughts section. This is not real frames, but it does help smooth out the motion on the screen. And you know, it just doesn't improve the responsiveness of the game, and it can add some image quality artifacts. So it's going to be, I think a lot of people would want to use it if you have a high enough base frame rate so the game still feels pretty responsive, and we'll talk again more about that in the final thoughts. Fine, I'll give some sort of a summary chart. Now, I often don't do this because I'm more into the nuance of the results, and just throwing everything into an average at the end, yes, I understand is useful and interesting as well, but I think sometimes it can hide as much as it reveals. But anyway, let's look at the chart and then go into how outliers influenced the overall results that we ended up getting in that chart. Anyway, whatever. So here we're seeing the 2060 as 81% faster on average than the 1060. We're seeing in these results. So basically all those little red number generational uplifts there, I added all of those up and divided by how many there were to produce an average percent gain generationally. But you'll notice I can't do that for the 1060 because I didn't have a 960 involved in the test, if that makes sense. Anyway, so we're seeing on average in these results, and again, these results are the latest games at either their max settings or sometimes also very near their max settings. We're seeing the 20s, and by the way, these are with no ray tracing involved in the results. We're seeing the 2060 81% ahead of the 1060 on average, and then we're seeing the 3060 28% ahead of the 2060 on average, and then the 4060 only 17% ahead of the 3060 on average. And again, this is without ray tracing. If we include, if I only focus on the ray tracing results, I now have to throw out the 2060 as well, because I can't say how much better the 2060 is at ray tracing than its previous generation, unless I just called it infinite, which doesn't show up very well on a chart. So really, we can just look at the 3060 was 79.1% better at ray tracing in this testing than the 2060. And I don't think it's just that its ray tracing cores are 79% better. I think it's that a lot of times the ray tracing settings use way more than 6 gigabytes of VRAM, and that caused the 3060 to have a larger actual performance gain than its just raw power would give it, just because the 2060's performance is being held back by its VRAM capacity. And that's the same issue we're seeing with the 4060. The 4060's overall performance is being held back relatively to the 3060 because of how frequently the ray tracing settings spilled over the VRAM capacity. So we're seeing on average in the tests I ran here, the 4060 only 6.9% faster at ray tracing than the 3060. But this is again why I feel like charts like this, average results at the end, are interesting, but they also, when I teach my students a lot of times about, stats and averages and all of that, I might ask a question like, does this mean you will see games where the 4060 is 6.9% faster than the 3060 at ray tracing? And the answer is probably not. What this really means is that in some situations, we had a 20% jump in ray tracing, because I think that's more like the actual performance jump generationally when not held back by VRAM capacity. But then we saw games like, Resident Evil at the max settings, where the 4060 was actually slower than the 3060, right? And then that's balancing out that result, and it was slower because it was running over its VRAM capacity, right? So in the end, this type of chart is useful in the sense that it does encapsulate all of the information into some kind of average. But I think if you were going to then use, if I was given the average FPS count of a 3060 and asked to predict the FPS count of the 4060, I would not multiply by 1.069 because I don't think that's actually what's going to happen. It's either going to be a 20% increase or it's going to spill over its VRAM capacity and probably either be brought down even or even lose based on the results that we saw here. And again, I think the same thing is happening with this. I don't think the 3060 is actually 79% faster at ray tracing than the 2060 when we're not held back by VRAM, but the thing was we were often held back by VRAM. Now, VRAM issues are also, I think, playing into these results. The 2060, and then the 3060, for example, when we're not going over 6 gigabytes of VRAM, usually isn't 28% faster than the, let me just find some random result. One of the ones, I think Returnal wasn't particularly VRAM heavy. See, when we're not particularly VRAM heavy, we see the 2060 is 68% faster than the 1060, and the 3060 more like 24% faster than the 2060, right? We're seeing lower generational differences here. It's just when the VRAM capacity does spill over that we see this accentuated. But that is happening in the latest games. Now, you could try to control that by reducing settings to a point where you stay within your VRAM buffer. But honestly, that can be kind of just an annoying thing to have to do, right? But that is something you have to do as cards get older. But it's very frustrating on a brand new $300 GPU. And we certainly were seeing at least some situations where that was already causing problems for the 4060. Anyway, so I think there was a lot of interesting results here. Now, I don't own a 960. It would have been interesting to go back and look at that. Now, if you explore something like the Tech Power Up GPU database, where you can look at some further, I like just how complete this database is. If you go back to the GTX 960, it looks like that card was a 2015 card for $200. If we want to look at a little more generational stuff, now they're reporting, if we scroll up to the 1060, 6 gigabyte, a 72% generational uplift from the 960 to the 1060. But I have a feeling if we retested, if I actually had a 960 and put it in these same benchmarks, I have a feeling that that performance difference would actually be much larger, because the 960 was a 2 gigabyte graphics card, right? I'm pretty sure it was a 2 gigabyte graphics card, yeah. So in these modern games, I have a feeling like the 960 at these settings we were using would be getting absolutely crushed, and that we would see the 6 gigabyte 1060 more than 72% ahead of that. Now, if we click on the 1060 as a baseline and look at how this lines up to the results that we were seeing, so the 1060 was a $300 graphics card, came out in 2016. So that was a $100 price bump from the 960 to the 1060, apparently. This was before I had a channel, so some of this, I kind of vaguely paid attention to, but this was actually more before I was paying this close of attention to these things. This was kind of fun to look back at here. So this was a $300 graphics card. And then if we look at what their reported jump up to the 2060, they're reporting about a 59%, so about a 60% jump from the 1060 to the 2060. However, again, I think a lot of times this testing data is based on old tests from when these first came out. Now, I'm pretty sure that the 1060, while it does support DirectX 12, it isn't as good at DirectX 12 as later GPUs were. Meaning, I think at the time, when you looked at it relatively to other GPUs, like I think wasn't competing against like the 480 from AMD, that kind of thing, I think it had a lack of, what was it, asynchronous compute or something like that, like a hardware controller for that, something like that. I remember there being something about the 1060 that made it less good at DX12 than some other GPUs and some that came later. So I think that could be playing into why I'm seeing such a larger difference between the 1060 and the 2060. I'm seeing in the latest games, which again, these were all DX12 games, because I'm testing the most recent games at heavy settings. These are DX12 games, and we are seeing an 81% jump from the 1060 to the 2060. So again, if I'm just speculating on what's going on here, could it be just drivers are more focused on the newer GPUs? Yes. Could it be issues with DX12 support on the 1060? Sure, it could be. I couldn't tell you exactly why, but it certainly looks like this difference has grown over time, and we can't just chalk it up to VRAM, because both of these are 6 gigabyte cards. If we set the 2060 as our baseline, this card was a $350 card. So while we did see a large jump from the 1060 to the 2060, it was at a $50 price increase going from the 1060 to the 2060. Although, you did gain DLSS, and we didn't look at a lot of that here, but it is certainly nice to have, at the time with DLSS 1 when the card launched, that wasn't that great of a thing. Although nowadays, if you're trying to hang on to your 2060 for a while, I think gaining the DLSS 2 support is certainly useful for boosting some performance. Even at 1080p, while I wouldn't like to use the upscaling, if you're on a card that's aging a bit, it certainly could be a reasonable trade-off to make, along with some other graphic settings tweaks to boost performance. So it's nice to have that. A little less excited to have ray tracing at this point. We didn't really see the 2060 delivering stellar ray tracing results in any of our tests here in the latest ray tracing titles. Anyway, jumping from the 2060 to the 3060. Where is it here? There's got to be a 3060. There it is, 3060 12 gigabyte. So these charts are reporting a 19% bump. Again, if we look at my results, I'm seeing a 28% bump. But again, I think that is influenced by how frequently we're going over 6 gigabytes of VRAM usage, which I don't think would have been the case when the 3060 first launched, at least as frequently. There were certainly games going over 6 gigabytes of VRAM at the time. A lot of them are right up against 8, but many more games that would have been used in reviews at the time, I think would not have been as VRAM demanding as games now are, that are programmed for the latest consoles like the PS5 and the Series X. So that could go some way to explaining the larger performance gap here, with the 3060 being 28% ahead in my testing. Because again, if you look at it game by game, There are definitely examples of, like, for example, exactly a 19% gain from the 2060 to the 3060. I certainly do see that result happening. It's just that sometimes we get a much larger performance jump, like what we're seeing in The Last of Us, for example, even down at like 1080p high settings. We actually are seeing a 40% jump from the 2060 to the 3060. At ultra settings, a 47% jump from the 2060 to the 3060. And here you can definitely see, going into the 8 gigabytes of usage and 9 gigabytes of allocation at these settings. So again, I think the current averages differences being higher accentuated by the VRAM. And I guess what that's bringing me to at the end here is we're already seeing the generational gain of the 4060 versus the 3060 a bit depressed from where it could have been by some cases where we do go over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and that especially happening in ray tracing results. And again, this is at the card's launch. I'm interested what will happen, if I do a video like this 2 or 3 years from now, whenever the 5060 comes out, how the difference between the 3060 and the 4060 will have changed at that point in time, relative to what we're seeing in this video, if I test the latest games. I have a feeling when the 5060 launches, we'll be seeing more and more games targeting more than 8 gigabytes at their maximum settings, because they'll be more and more focused on the most recent console releases. And consoles have 16 gigabytes of unified memory, which can easily put at least 12 towards VRAM, and then consoles handle things differently. Also, PC settings can often go up to higher resolutions, higher settings, higher ray tracing settings, which can use even more VRAM, right? I would just see that going up over time. So interesting stuff for sure. I think the one standout good thing, I guess, that I'm seeing for the let me jump into this for a second here. The 3060 was really not that impressive a generational jump, right? Compared to what we'd seen on the previous cards. We saw a big jump using this chart, from the 960 to the 1060. We then saw a big jump from the 1060 to the 2060, although it came with a $50 price hike. From the 2060 to the 3060, we only see a 19% bump here, although in my testing it was more, because the VRAM actually did end up helping quite a bit in a few years' time, right, at the latest settings. But that one did actually come with a bit of a price cut, although actually getting it at its MSRP was very difficult for a long time. That one went down to $329, so still more expensive than 1060, but less expensive than the 2060. And then we're now seeing the 4060 out, cutting that back down to $299, where we saw the 1060. And now there's been many years of inflation and all that, so you could say that what does the 4060 have going for it? At least they cut the price, okay? Rather than increasing the price or staying the same, at least they cut the price. And that's the main thing that I have to say going for it, is at least they cut the price. And it does have frame generation, which I did test at the end of the video. I've talked about this so much more in my other videos and all that, but it is a nice-to-have feature, but is situational. Not every game supports it, and you wouldn't want to use it in competitive games because it does increase latency a bit. But in certain single-player titles that do support it, if you can get a high enough base frame rate, it is a nice-to-have feature. But anyway, watch my other videos for that. So that certainly has some other things going for it. I would hate the 4060 a lot more if it hadn't cut the price. At least they cut the price, because I think it goes some way towards admitting that it's a 3050 successor. Because if we do look at the 3050, for example, the 3050 was an 8 gigabyte GPU with a $250 MSRP. What if we had got the 4060 at about $250 with that same 8 gigabytes of VRAM, but a lot more powerful and with frame generation? Then I think it would be a card people would be more excited about. But anyway, we could continue rambling on about all sorts of things here. There was some interesting data to look at for sure, and I don't know, it was certainly disappointing to see situations where we actually did see the 4060 lose to the 3060. There was No other situation. Like, did I ever see the 2060 lose to the 1060? No. Did we ever see the 3060 lose to the 2060? No. Did we ever see the 4060 lose to the 3060? Yes. And that's strictly due to the VRAM cut, which is unfortunate. Anyway, I think I've wow, I talked way longer than I thought I would about all this. Anyway, thank you guys if you made it to the end. I'll let you go now. I hope you have an excellent day.